My name is Caleb, and I never thought I'd be sharing this story. If you had told me a month ago that I would be standing here, telling people about what happened to me on that cold October night, I would have laughed and walked away. But something changed, something so profound that it left me with no choice. I need you to hear this, not because I want attention, but because I know what's coming and you need to be ready. It had been one of those never-ending days. I had worked a double shift at the hospital, running between patients and paperwork, barely stopping long enough to catch my breath. By the time I got into my car, it was already past midnight. The rain had been relentless all day, and it didn't let up as I pulled onto the highway. The wipers scraped across the windshield in a rhythmic pattern, but even they struggled to keep up with the sheets of water pouring down. I was exhausted, bone-tired in a way that made every muscle ache. My mind drifted as I thought about my wife and kids, probably fast asleep by now. All I wanted was to see their faces in the morning, to feel the warmth of their hugs. That thought kept me going as I squinted through the rain, trying to focus on the blurry road ahead. The first thing I noticed was the headlights. They appeared out of nowhere, veering across the median straight toward me. I didn't even have time to react. There was the screech of tires, the deafening crash of metal on metal, and then nothing, silence. But it wasn't just the absence of sound. It was deeper, as if the entire world had been muted. I felt myself floating, weightless and detached. When I looked down, I saw the wreckage. My car crumpled like a tin can, glass scattered across the wet asphalt, and my body slumped against the steering wheel. It didn't feel real. I wasn't in pain, I wasn't even scared. There was just peace. A warmth began to spread through me, and I felt an invisible force pulling me upward. The scene below faded away as I was drawn toward a light. It wasn't like any light I'd ever seen before, soft yet blinding, distant yet all-encompassing. I don't know how long I floated there, suspended in the glow. Time didn't seem to exist anymore. Then I felt it, a presence. It was overwhelming, like the purest love and the deepest truth had wrapped themselves around me. And then I heard a voice that didn't just speak to my ears but to my very soul. Caleb. The sound of my name sent shivers through me. I turned, and there he was. I don't know how I knew it was him, I just did. His presence was undeniable. His eyes met mine, and in that moment, every barrier I'd ever built around my heart crumbled. There was no hiding, no pretense. He saw everything. "You are safe," he said, his voice both gentle and commanding. "But there is much you need to see." I wanted to speak, to ask him why I was there, what was happening, but no words came. It was as if he already knew every question before I could form it. He reached out his hand, and though I hesitated, something deep within me urged me to take it. The moment our hands touched, the light around us intensified and the scene shifted. I was no longer floating in the void. Instead, I stood in the middle of what looked like a grand cathedral. The air was filled with music, beautiful, soaring melodies that seemed to reach into the heavens. Rows of people stood with their arms raised, their faces glowing with what looked like pure devotion. At first I was awestruck. The music, the unity, the passion, it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. But then I noticed something strange. The melodies began to twist, subtly at first, like a single sour note hidden within a symphony. The people's faces, once serene, began to change. Their expressions grew strained, almost desperate, as if they were searching for something they couldn't find. "Do you see?" His voice broke through the haze of confusion. I turned to him, my heart pounding. "What's happening?" "They look like they are worshiping, but something's wrong." He nodded, his expression heavy with sorrow. "They believe they are praising me, but their hearts are far from me. The enemy has found a way to infiltrate even this sacred act." The weight of his words hit me like a tidal wave. I looked back at the congregation, and suddenly I saw it. The subtle ways the enemy had crept in. The music, though beautiful, was laced with pride and performance. The people were more focused on the emotion of the moment than the one they were supposed to be worshiping. They sing the songs, but their hearts chase after other gods, he said. The enemy uses what is good and twists it, making even praise an act of distraction. I felt a deep ache in my chest, a mix of sorrow and anger. How can this happen? How can something so pure be corrupted? It begins with small compromises, he replied, his voice steady. A shift in focus, a desire for recognition, an elevation of the self. And soon, what was meant to glorify becomes a tool for deceit. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The vision continued, showing me church after church, each one echoing the same pattern. The music, the lights, the performances, they were all designed to stir emotions, but they lacked true connection to the spirit. People were caught in a cycle of chasing feelings rather than seeking me. I wanted to argue to say that this couldn't be true for everyone, that surely many still worshipped with pure hearts. But before I could speak, the scene shifted again. I was no longer in a grand cathedral, but in a small, dimly lit room. A group of people stood in a circle, their heads bowed in prayer. There was no music, no flashing lights, no fanfare, just quiet reverence. I felt his presence beside me, and he spoke softly. This is what I desire, spirit and truth. Their voices are not loud, but their hearts are full. They seek me, not a feeling, not a performance. The contrast between this scene and the others was stark, and it pierced my soul. I wanted to weep for the times I had stood in church, raising my hands while my mind wandered or my heart stayed focused on my own worries. How many times had I allowed distractions to pull me away from true worship? Before I could dwell too long on my own shortcomings, the light around us dimmed, and the room disappeared. I was plunged into darkness, a suffocating void that seemed to press in on every side. Panic began to rise in me, but then I heard his voice again, calm and steady. Do not be afraid. Suddenly, shapes began to emerge in the darkness. I saw shadows moving, figures lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. Their forms were grotesque, twisted, and constantly shifting, as if they couldn't hold their shape for long. They whispered to each other, their voices like nails scraping against glass, and their eyes glowed with a sinister light. These are the forces at work, he said, his voice cutting through the whispers like a blade. They sow discord, pride, and distraction. They masquerade as light but lead my people astray. I wanted to look away, but he wouldn't let me. You must understand the battle, he said. It is not waged with weapons you can see. It is fought in the hearts and minds of my people, and it begins with worship, for that is where the enemy strikes first. The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy cloak. Worship, something I had always thought of as pure and untouchable, was a battleground. The enemy was cunning, using something meant to bring us closer to God as a tool to drive us further away. I watched as one of the shadowy figures moved closer to what appeared to be a small, flickering light in the distance. The light seemed fragile, barely holding its own against the surrounding darkness. The figure reached out, its clawed hand poised to snuff it out, but then something incredible happened. The light grew brighter and the figure recoiled, hissing and retreating into the shadows. The brighter the light became, the more the darkness seemed to falter until finally it was pushed back entirely. You see, he said, his voice filled with both sorrow and hope. The light cannot be overcome, but it must be tended, nurtured. When my people worship in spirit and truth, their light shines brighter and the darkness cannot stand against it. But when their worship becomes hollow, when their hearts are divided, their light dims, and the enemy finds his way in. I felt tears streaming down my face as I watched the light grow and push back the darkness. The simplicity of it was staggering. True worship, untainted by pride or distraction, was a weapon, a powerful, unstoppable force against the enemy. The scene faded, and I found myself standing in the void again, alone with him. I couldn't find the words to express what I was feeling, the weight of what I had seen. All I could do was fall to my knees. Why me? I finally managed to ask, my voice trembling. Why are you showing me this? Because you must tell them, he said simply. There are many who are deceived, but there are also many who are seeking truth. You must show them the way back to me." I shook my head, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he was asking. But I'm just one person. Who would even listen to me? He knelt beside me, his presence radiating reassurance. "It is not about who you are, but about who I am. Speak the truth and I will do the rest. Trust me, Caleb." I wanted to believe him, but doubt still gnawed at me. How could I, an ordinary man, carry a message this important? Would anyone even care? As if sensing my thoughts, he reached out and touched my shoulder. The warmth of his touch spread through me, calming the storm of doubt and fear. "You are not alone," he said. "I am with you always. Remember that." Before I could respond, the light around us began to fade, and I felt myself being pulled back. The peace I had felt in his presence was replaced by the jarring sensation of pain and chaos. The world came rushing back in a blur of sounds and sensations, sirens, voices, the sharp sting of broken glass against my skin. I opened my eyes to see the faces of paramedics hovering over me, their voices urgent but distant. My body ached and every breath was a struggle, but I was alive. Somehow, I had been given another chance. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I closed my eyes and whispered a silent prayer. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew I had to. I had to tell the world what I had seen. The days that followed were a blur of hospital rooms and physical recovery. My body healed faster than my mind could catch up. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the vision again. The churches, the worship, the distorted praise. The haunting images stayed with me like an unshakable shadow, reminding me of the message I had been given. There were moments, fleeting and uncertain, when I questioned whether it had all been a dream, a product of the trauma I had endured. But every time I allowed myself to dismiss it, I felt the weight of his presence pressing on my soul. I couldn't ignore what I had seen. The hardest part wasn't the physical pain or the long recovery. It was the fear that no one would believe me. How could I explain what had happened to me? How could I tell people that I had died, crossed over to the other side, and been shown a truth so profound and unsettling? Would they look at me like I had lost my mind? But then, as I sat alone in my hospital room one quiet evening, I felt that familiar tug, the same pull I had felt when I was first drawn toward the light. It wasn't physical, but it was real. I felt him with me, guiding me, reassuring me. "Do not be afraid," his voice echoed in my mind. "You have seen the truth. Now it is time to speak." I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. The fear of rejection, of ridicule, seemed insignificant compared to the urgency of the message. I had been given a glimpse of what was happening in the world, how even the most sacred acts of worship could be twisted to deceive, and I had to share it. I began speaking to friends and family, sharing my experience in pieces, letting the words spill out slowly at first. Some listened with concern, their eyes filled with skepticism but also curiosity. Others dismissed me, labeling it as a near-death hallucination, a side effect of trauma. But a few listened with a quiet understanding. I'll never forget the day I spoke to my pastor. It was a Sunday after church, and the congregation had emptied out, leaving behind the soft echoes of hymns and prayers still lingering in the air. I stood in his office, my heart racing as I tried to find the right words. "Pastor, I need to talk to you," I said, my voice shaking despite myself. He looked up from his desk, his expression gentle. "Of course, Caleb. What's on your mind?" I hesitated, the weight of what I was about to say almost too much to bear. But then I remembered the vision, the urgency of his words, and I knew there was no turning back. I died," I began, and his eyes widened, but he remained silent. "I died in that car accident, and I saw something I need to share with you." As I told him what I had seen, what I had been shown, I could see the shock in his eyes. I could hear the hesitation in his voice as he asked questions, tried to understand what I was saying. And then, after what felt like an eternity of silence, he nodded slowly. "I believe you, Caleb," he said softly. I can feel the weight of what you're saying, and I think you're right. We've been so caught up in the rituals, the emotions, that we've lost sight of the heart of worship. That moment marked the beginning of a shift in my life. I couldn't stop what had been set in motion, but there were times when I wondered if the weight of the truth was too much to bear. I found myself seeking out other pastors, leaders, and people of faith, sharing the message I had been given. The more I spoke, the more I realized that I wasn't alone. There were others who had felt the same disconnection, the same emptiness in their worship, but they had no words to describe it. It was as if the veil had been lifted from my eyes, and I could see the subtle ways the enemy was at work. I saw how our attention had been diverted from God to our own feelings, our own desires. I saw how pride had crept in, how we had become more concerned with our image than our hearts. And I saw how, in many places, the focus had shifted from true worship to a form of idolatry. The music, the lights, the performances. It was all meant to stir our emotions, but it left us empty. I became restless, my heart yearning to make a difference, to call people back to the heart of true worship. I didn't have all the answers, and I didn't know exactly what needed to change, but I knew that I couldn't sit idly by while the deception continued to spread. Every day, I fought the temptation to retreat, to stay quiet and comfortable. There were moments when doubt crept in, when I wondered if anyone would really listen, if anyone would care. But then I would remember the light, the pure light that pushed back the darkness, and I knew I had no choice but to keep moving forward. I started small, speaking at small Bible studies and gatherings, sharing what I had seen. I was met with resistance, skepticism, and sometimes indifference, but there were also moments of breakthrough. I could see the flicker of recognition in people's eyes as they realized that what I was saying was true. They too had felt it, the emptiness, the disconnection, and they were hungry for something more. The more I shared, the more I realized that the message wasn't just for churches, it was for all of us. Our lives were filled with distractions, idols, and misplaced priorities. We had allowed the enemy to infiltrate every aspect of our lives, from our worship to our relationships to our work. And it was only by returning to the simplicity of true worship, heartfelt, humble, and focused on God, that we could fight back. I don't know how much time we have, but I do know this. We need to stay vigilant, rooted in faith, and unafraid to speak the truth. The darkness is real and it's closing in, but we have the light. We have the truth. And as long as we keep our eyes on Him, no darkness can ever overcome us. Months turned into years, and the message I had been given became the central focus of my life. I shared it wherever I could, churches, community centers, even online. Sometimes the response was overwhelming, with people thanking me for saying what they had felt but couldn't articulate. Other times, it was lonely, with people turning away, accusing me of fear-mongering or imagining things. I learned to accept that not everyone would believe me, but it didn't make it any easier. The burden of carrying such a heavy truth often felt isolating. There were nights when I would lie awake, questioning whether I was making any difference at all. I longed for the peace I had felt in His presence during the experience, but in its place was a constant, gnawing urgency. One evening, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at a blank notebook. I had been invited to speak at a large church conference the following week, and the weight of what I was supposed to say felt heavier than ever. I had shared my testimony countless times before, but this felt different. There was a stirring in my spirit, a sense that this moment was pivotal. I bowed my head and prayed, pouring out my doubts and fears. Lord, I don't know if I'm strong enough for this. What if I fail You? What if they don't listen? As I prayed, a familiar warmth filled the room and I felt His presence. It wasn't as overwhelming as it had been during my near-death experience, but it was unmistakable. Trust me, His voice echoed in my heart. You are not responsible for how they respond. Your task is to speak the truth. I will do the rest. The weight of His words lifted something inside me. I wasn't alone in this. The results weren't up to me, they were up to Him. My job was to be faithful, nothing more, nothing less. The day of the conference arrived, and as I stood backstage, waiting for my turn to speak, I could feel the nervous energy coursing through me. The auditorium was packed, filled with pastors, worship leaders, and congregants from across the region. The air buzzed with anticipation, and I could hear the distant hum of a worship band warming up on stage. When my name was called, I stepped onto the stage, the bright lights blinding me for a moment. I gripped the microphone tightly, my heart pounding as I looked out at the sea of faces. "I want to share a story with you," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "It's not an easy story to tell, but it's one I believe you need to hear." I took a deep breath and began recounting my near-death experience, sparing no detail. I described the accident, the light, and the overwhelming peace of his presence. I shared the visions I had been shown, the twisted worship, the distractions, the subtle infiltration of the enemy. The room was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy with meaning. I could see the expressions on their faces. Some were skeptical, their arms crossed, their brows furrowed. Others were captivated, leaning forward in their seats. When I reached the part about the shadowy figures and the fragile light, I paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. "The light cannot be overcome," I said, my voice steady now, "but it must be tended. True worship, worship in spirit and truth, is our weapon. It's what pushes back the darkness." I could feel the tension in the room shift as I spoke those words. People began nodding, their expressions softening. Some wiped tears from their eyes. As I finished, I felt a wave of peace wash over me, the same peace I had felt when he told me to trust him. I wasn't sure what impact my words would have, but I knew I had done what I was called to do. After the conference, people approached me one by one, some thanking me, others asking how they could bring this message to their own communities. But what stayed with me most was a conversation with an older woman who approached me with tears streaming down her face. "I've been in church my whole life," she said, her voice trembling. "But for years, I felt like something was missing. I couldn't put it into words until now. Thank you for helping me see what I couldn't see before." Her words reminded me why I was doing this, why the message mattered. It wasn't about me. It was about awakening hearts to the truth, about calling people back to him. As I drove home that night, the weight I had carried for so long felt a little lighter. I still didn't know what the future held, but I knew I wasn't walking this path alone. The journey wasn't over, far from it. There were still so many who needed to hear the truth, so many who were searching for something real amidst the noise and distraction. But for the first time, I felt a deep, abiding hope. The darkness was real, and the battle was ongoing, but I had seen the light. I had seen its power, its purity, and its resilience. And I knew that as long as we stayed rooted in him, as long as we worshipped in spirit and truth, the darkness would never win. As time went on, I found myself stepping further into this calling, though it often felt like walking on a tightrope between faith and fear. The message I carried wasn't just about worship. It was about the condition of the heart, the ways we've let distractions creep in and distort our connection to God. The resistance grew too. Not everyone wanted to hear the truth, especially when it challenged comfortable routines or exposed hidden compromises. I was called a fanatic by some, accused of being too harsh or too dramatic. "Worship is supposed to make people feel good," one pastor told me after I shared my testimony at his church. "You can't just come in here and tell people they're doing it wrong." His words stung, but I remembered what Jesus had told me: speak the truth. It wasn't about pleasing people, it was about obedience. Still, the rejection weighed on me. One night, after a particularly discouraging meeting, I found myself sitting in my car, parked on an empty street. Rain tapped against the windshield, and the faint glow of streetlights illuminated the droplets sliding down the glass. I felt utterly spent, as though I had poured out everything I had and it still wasn't enough. "Why me?" I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of my frustration. "Why did you choose me for this? I'm not strong enough, I'm not wise enough." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, heavy with a presence I had come to recognize. And in that stillness I felt him speak to my heart again. I don't call the equipped, I equip the called. Those words anchored me, reminding me that it wasn't about my ability. It was about his. Despite the challenges, there were moments of undeniable breakthrough, and those kept me going. One such moment came during a small gathering at a rural church. The pastor had invited me to speak, and though I expected the turnout to be modest, the room was packed. People had driven from neighboring towns to hear the message. As I spoke, I felt an unusual intensity, as though the Spirit was moving through every word. I shared the vision again, the counterfeit worship, the shadows twisting what was meant to glorify God. I warned them about the subtle traps, the way pride and self-centeredness could infiltrate even the holiest of spaces. When I finished, there was a long silence. I thought I had lost them, that maybe my words had been too much. But then, one by one, people began to stand, tears streaming down their faces. I felt it, a young woman said, her voice trembling. I didn't know how to explain it, but I felt it, the emptiness. I've been going through the motions, but my heart hasn't been in it. Her confession opened the floodgates. Others began to speak, their voices raw with emotion. People repented openly, crying out to God for forgiveness and renewal. The worship that followed wasn't polished or perfect. It was messy, unplanned, and utterly beautiful. For the first time in a long time, I saw what true worship looked like, humble, heartfelt, and entirely focused on Him. That night, as I drove home under a sky full of stars, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. It wasn't that the battle was over or that the work was done, but I saw a glimpse of what was possible when people's hearts were truly awakened. The vision of the light and shadows stayed with me, as vivid as the day I first saw it. I realized that the light wasn't just in churches or worship. It was in every act of love, every moment of surrender, every time we chose Him over the distractions of the world. The enemy's strategy was clear: to divide, distract, and distort. But God's strategy was even clearer: to unite, refocus, and purify. And it began with each of us in the quiet places of our hearts, where the true battle was fought. I began to see the fruits of the message in unexpected ways. People I had spoken to started reaching out, sharing how they had begun changing their worship practices, their prayer lives, and even their relationships. Churches that had once prioritized performance over presence were beginning to shift, focusing more on authenticity and less on perfection. But it wasn't just about worship services. The message was spreading into people's everyday lives, how they worked, how they loved, how they spent their time. The light was growing, pushing back the shadows in ways I couldn't have orchestrated on my own. Still, there were days when the darkness seemed overwhelming. The more the light spread, the harder the enemy fought back. I began to experience spiritual attacks, nightmares, unexplained anxieties, and moments of crushing doubt. But in those moments, I clung to the promise He had given me: the light cannot be overcome. One particularly difficult night, I found myself revisiting the memory of the accident, the moment my life changed forever. I thought about how easily things could have gone differently, how I could have stayed in the light and never returned to this broken world. But then, I remembered the urgency in His voice, the sorrow in His eyes as He showed me the shadows creeping into the churches. He had brought me back for a reason, and as hard as it was, I knew I couldn't give up, so I pressed on, one step at a time, trusting that He was with me, guiding me, equipping me. The battle was far from over, but I knew this: the light would always prevail, and as long as I kept my eyes on Him, I would never walk alone. The weight of carrying the vision remained, but so did the peace I had found in knowing the work wasn't mine alone. Over time, my testimony began to ripple outward in ways I hadn't anticipated. People I had never met started sharing how the message had reached them. Some wrote letters, others sent emails, and some approached me in person after hearing me speak. There was a common theme in their words: a yearning for something deeper, something real. They spoke of how they'd felt the emptiness I had described, how they had gone through the motions of faith, but had lost sight of the one they were meant to worship. One evening, after a long day of traveling to another small-town church, I received a message from a man named Daniel. He explained that he had been a worship leader for over 15 years but had recently stepped down, feeling disillusioned and drained. "I didn't even know why I was leading worship anymore," he wrote. "It became about the music, the production, the applause. Somewhere along the way, I lost the heart of it, but when I heard your story, it broke me. For the first time in years, I felt God's presence in a way I can't describe. Thank you for helping me remember why I started." His words brought tears to my eyes. It was moments like these that reminded me why I had been given this task. It wasn't about convincing everyone or fixing every problem. It was about reaching the ones who were ready to hear, the ones whose hearts were open to the truth. As the months turned into years, the message began to take on a life of its own. People started forming small groups to discuss the vision, diving into scripture to understand how to guard their hearts and worship in spirit and truth. Churches began reevaluating their practices, shifting their focus from entertainment to intimacy with God. But the resistance didn't stop. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger the more the message spread. I received criticism from leaders who felt threatened by the implications of my testimony. Some accused me of being judgmental, of sowing division instead of unity. One particularly painful moment came when a close friend, someone I had trusted and confided in, told me they could no longer support what I was doing. "I just don't think this is from God," they said, their voice heavy with finality. "You're making people question too much. It's not healthy." Their words cut deep, leaving me questioning everything once again. But as I brought my doubts to God, He reminded me of the first moment I had heard His voice, the unmistakable clarity of His presence. "Obedience isn't easy," He whispered to my heart, "but it is worth it." That reassurance became my anchor. I realized that the pushback wasn't a sign of failure. It was a sign that the message was hitting where it mattered most. The enemy didn't fight against what wasn't a threat. One day, I received an unexpected invitation to speak at a large conference, a gathering of pastors and leaders from across the country. The thought of standing before such an influential audience was daunting, but I felt a deep sense of urgency to go. When the day arrived, I walked onto the stage with a mix of nerves and resolve. As I began to speak, I could feel the weight of the room, the unspoken tension as people listened. I didn't hold back. I shared everything, the vision, the warnings, the call to return to true worship. I spoke of how easily we can be deceived, how the enemy's greatest tactic is to make us complacent, comfortable, and distracted. When I finished, the silence was deafening. I could feel the tension, the unspoken resistance in some of the faces staring back at me. But then, slowly, a man in the front row stood. He was an older pastor, his face lined with years of experience. "Everything you've said," he began, his voice trembling, "is what I've been afraid to admit for years. Our churches have lost their way. We've traded conviction for comfort, transformation for entertainment. But no more. Thank you for being brave enough to speak what needed to be said." His words ignited something in the room. Others began to stand, some weeping openly, others nodding in agreement. It was as though a dam had broken, releasing years of pent-up longing for something real. That night, I felt a glimmer of hope that the tide was turning. It wasn't about me or my story. It was about what God was doing through it. As I drove home, I thought again of the light I had seen during my near-death experience. It wasn't just a vision, it was a promise. A promise that the darkness could never overcome the light, no matter how pervasive it seemed. I knew the road ahead would still be challenging. The enemy wouldn't give up easily and the battle would continue. But I also knew this. The light was spreading, one heart at a time, and no force in hell could stop it. And so I pressed on, not in my own strength but in His. The message wasn't mine to carry alone. It belonged to him. And as long as I stayed rooted in that truth, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. Years passed, and though the intensity of my experience never faded, it began to take on a different texture, a steady undercurrent of purpose rather than the sharp urgency that had first gripped me. The vision of light and shadows remained as vivid as the day I had first seen it, but now it lived alongside the rhythms of my daily life. I began to see how God worked not just in the grand, dramatic moments, but in the quiet, ordinary acts of obedience. One of the most unexpected places I found this was in my own home. For so long, I had been so focused on spreading the message that I hadn't realized the work that needed to be done in my family. My children had grown older, and I began to see how the same battle I had witnessed in the spiritual realm was playing out in their lives. It wasn't dramatic or obvious. It was subtle. The endless scroll of their phones, the constant pull of social media, the way their focus seemed to drift during family prayers. I recognized the distractions for what they were. Shadows, slowly creeping in to steal their attention, their joy, their connection to God. One evening I gathered my family in the living room. The TV was off, and for once their phones were out of sight. I could tell they were curious, maybe even a little wary about what I was going to say. "I need to tell you something," I began, my voice steady but full of emotion. "I've been so focused on sharing this message with the world that I forgot the most important place to start, right here with you." I told them everything, starting with the accident, the vision, and the warning Jesus had given me. I spoke about how the enemy's tactics weren't just about churches, but about families, relationships, and individual hearts. At first, they listened in silence. My oldest son, who had recently started college, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. My daughter's eyes flicked toward her phone as though she were tempted to reach for it. But as I kept speaking, something shifted. My voice cracked as I told them how much I loved them, how much I wanted them to experience the fullness of God's presence in their lives. Tears welled up in my eyes, and to my surprise, I saw the same in theirs. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then my son spoke. "I've felt it too," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The distractions, the emptiness." I didn't know what it was, but I get it now. That night, something changed in our family. We didn't suddenly become perfect, far from it, but there was a new sense of awareness, a shared commitment to fight against the shadows together. We started small, setting aside time each evening to pray and talk about our faith. It wasn't always easy or convenient, but it was real, and it brought us closer than we had been in years. At the same time, the message continued to spread beyond our home. I began hearing from people in places I had never visited, sharing how the vision had inspired them to make changes in their own lives and communities. Small groups were forming, not because of anything I had done, but because God was working through the testimony. One day, I received a letter from a young woman in a city thousands of miles away. She described how she had been part of a worship team at a large church, but over time, she had felt her heart drifting. "I started to care more about how I looked on stage than how I was connecting with God," she wrote. "Your story convicted me. I've stepped down from the team for now, not because I don't want to worship, but because I need to find my way back to Him first." Her words humbled me. They reminded me that the vision wasn't about creating movements or changing systems. It was about individual hearts turning back to God. But with every step forward, there were reminders of the ongoing battle. One night, I had another dream, one that felt eerily similar to the vision during my near-death experience. I was standing in a church, watching as the congregation sang in perfect harmony. Their voices were beautiful, but as I looked closer, I saw that many of their eyes were glazed over, their movements mechanical. Then I saw the shadows again, slithering between the pews, wrapping around the instruments and microphones. The light in the room dimmed and the atmosphere grew heavy, but this time, something was different. I saw a small group of people in the corner of the room, their faces lifted in genuine worship. Their light wasn't as loud or as dazzling as the rest, but it was pure and steady. As their light grew, the shadows began to recede. It wasn't immediate or easy, but it was undeniable. The message was clear. Even a small flame of true worship could drive back the darkness. When I woke, my heart was pounding, but I felt a renewed sense of hope. The battle wasn't over, but the light was spreading. Every act of obedience, every moment of surrender, every genuine cry of worship, it all mattered. The dream reminded me that the work wasn't just about exposing the shadows. It was about nurturing the light wherever it could be found. It was a reminder to keep going, to keep trusting, and to keep my eyes fixed on the one who had called me to this mission in the first place. The dream stayed with me, lingering in the corners of my mind and pressing into my spirit like a gentle but unyielding hand. I knew it wasn't just a message for me, it was a call to action. But what did it mean in practical terms? What more could I do? I had already shared my story with countless people. I had spoken in churches, at conferences, even on radio and podcasts. What more could God be asking of me? I prayed for clarity, and over the next few weeks the answer began to take shape, not in a single revelation but in small, consistent nudges. The light I had seen, the pure worship that had pushed back the shadows, wasn't confined to grand gestures or large platforms. It was in the quiet, everyday acts of faithfulness. It was in the homes of families, in small gatherings of believers, in the hearts of those willing to humble themselves before God. The message was simple: teach people how to worship again, not as a performance but as a way of life. I started small, gathering a handful of people in my living room. There was no microphone, no stage, no sound system, just a group of hearts hungry for something real. We opened the Bible, sang simple songs, and prayed, not for what we wanted, but for what God wanted to do in and through us. The first night felt awkward. Some people were hesitant to sing out loud. Others didn't know how to pray without scripted words. But as the weeks went by, something began to shift. There was a softness in the room, a sense of God's presence that couldn't be manufactured or explained. Word began to spread, and soon the living room was overflowing. We moved to a community center, then to a small church that offered its space during the week. The gatherings weren't about me, they were about Him. People came not to hear a message, but to encounter God. One night, a woman approached me after the gathering. She was in her late 40s, her eyes red from crying. "I've been in church my whole life," she said, her voice trembling. "But this is the first time I've ever truly felt Him. Thank you for reminding me what it means to worship." Her words broke something in me. They reminded me of the vision, of the faces in the congregation whose eyes were glazed over. How many more were like her, going through the motions, desperate for a real connection with God but not knowing how to find it? The gatherings continued to grow, but so did the challenges. Critics accused us of being too emotional, too unconventional. Others claimed we were trying to start a new movement, a cult even. The backlash hurt, but I reminded myself of what Jesus had said. "The deception coming is greater than you can imagine, but so is my power. Stay faithful." And so I stayed faithful. One evening, as I prepared for a gathering, I felt a deep heaviness settle over me. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the air itself was charged with something unseen. I knelt to pray, asking God to reveal what was happening. In that moment, I saw another vision, not as vivid as the one during my near-death experience, but clear enough to shake me to my core. I saw a great chasm opening in the earth, and from it poured a thick black smoke. The smoke spread quickly, filling the air and clouding the vision of everyone it touched. But then I saw beams of light piercing through the darkness. They weren't large or flashy, just small, steady streams of brilliance, like stars cutting through a moonless sky. Each beam seemed to come from a person, their hands lifted in worship, their hearts fully surrendered to God. The smoke couldn't extinguish the light. In fact, the light seemed to burn it away, inch by inch. It was a battle, slow and grueling, but the light was winning. When the vision ended, I was left trembling, tears streaming down my face. I knew what it meant. The darkness wasn't just a metaphor, it was real and it was spreading. But the light was just as real, and it was unstoppable for those who stayed rooted in the truth. That night, I shared the vision with the group. There was a solemnity in the room as I spoke, a weight that pressed on all of us. But there was also hope. We ended the night on our knees, crying out to God, not just for ourselves, but for the world around us, for the churches, the families, the hearts lost in the shadows. From that point on, the gatherings became more than just a place of worship. They became a place of intercession, a place where people came not just to encounter God for themselves, but to stand in the gap for others. The message was spreading in ways I could never have orchestrated on my own. People were taking what they experienced and bringing it back to their own communities, their own families. It wasn't about creating a brand or building a following. It was about igniting fires that would burn long after I was gone. And in the quiet moments when doubt crept in or the weight of it all felt too heavy, I would think back to that chasm and the beams of light. I would remember that no matter how dark the smoke became, the light could never be overcome. It wasn't my job to save the world. It was my job to shine where I was planted, to stay faithful to the one who had called me, and to trust that he would do the rest.